It is now my distinct honor to introduce the United States Senator from the great state of Arkansas, Senator Cotton. You get the far right. So, an enthusiastic crowd. I was estimating downstairs, I believe I've interviewed Senator Cotton more than 400 times, about weekly beginning in 2010. And so it's tough to come up with new questions, but not since his new book came out, Sacred Duty. And I want to start there, but in a backwards way. In 9/11, you were at Harvard Law School. Can you briefly review, in order to set up your time in the old guard, what you did after 9/11, how you came into service, and for those watching on C-SPAN who haven't seen you before, how you ended up at Harvard?
The answer to that last question is probably bad judgment. But I redeemed myself by joining the Army years later. So first off, let me thank the Nixon Library for hosting me today, and let me thank Hugh Hewitt for hosting me as well as his support for Sacred Duty on the radio program of these last couple of weeks. It's a true honor to be here, to have toured the museum earlier today and learned a little bit more about President Nixon and his life and his family. To get to your question, on 9/11, I was in a law school classroom in my last year of law school at Harvard, and I obviously thought I was going to be a lawyer, but from that date forward, I knew that my life had changed, as so many fellow Americans knew their lives had changed. So I did finish school and worked for a couple of years to repay all the loans I'd taken out for that legal education, but I knew I wanted to go serve, and as soon as I was done with repaying those loans and put all my affairs in order, I signed up for the Army, went to see some recruiters like we have here today, and Staff Sergeant. To his credit, Staff Sergeant Beamit, even though he saw me dressed like this walking in, which is probably not the typical walk-in you have from the streets, right? Asked me what I did, and I told him that I was a lawyer, and he said, well, you know, we have a JAG Corps, it's a different recruiting process, but we can sign you up for that, and you get to be a captain, which means more money and rank right away, and if you want to get overseas, you'll get overseas faster because your training will be done a lot faster than as an infantry officer. And I said that, no, I want to be an infantry officer, I want to go to Ranger School and Airborne School, I want to be a platoon leader overseas. And Sergeant Beamit said, you're not a very good lawyer, are you, sir? And very insightful NCO, because I guess I wasn't, but he signed me up, and that set me on the path to almost 5 years in the Army. After I got out of all that training at Fort Benning, I was, in fact, a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne in Iraq. Then the Army reassigned me to Arlington National Cemetery to serve with the Old Guard, where I was a platoon leader once again. And then my final assignment was a tour of duty in Afghanistan with the Provincial Reconstruction Team.
One of the things you will learn as you read Sacred Duty is a lot of small details that a civilian like me has no idea of. For example, I was talking to First Sergeant who's wearing his jump wings, and I said, I learned from Tom Cotton you can lose those. And you can lose them if you don't jump, but the Old Guard has a very special penalty and a unique obligation. Would you explain that to people?
Sure. So there aren't many badges in the Army that once earned you can lose. I think First Sergeant would say if you have your parachutist badge and you refuse to jump out of a military aircraft during an operation, training or combat, your parachutist badge can be revoked. Maybe scuba badges or something. There's a handful that can be revoked, but it's only for reasons related to the skill for which you earn that badge. That's not the case with the tomb badge for the tomb guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The second rarest badge in the Army. There's only been 667 issued in almost 60 years. The rarest badge is the astronaut badge, but as the tomb guards say, who joins the Army to be an astronaut? But uniquely in the Army, the tomb badge can be revoked not only once a tomb guard leaves the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but even after he leaves the Army altogether, and it can be revoked not for anything related to the performance of the craft of guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier, but anything that would bring discredit on the tomb of the unknown soldier platoon or the tomb itself. The revocation authority is the old guard commander, and in fact on what they call the badge board in their quarters that has a little brass plaque with every tomb guard's name and badge number, there are several plaques that say revoked. That's usually for some kind of misconduct or character infraction once one has left the platoon or even left the Army. Notably, in all of my time with the tomb guards over the last year, I didn't talk to a single young tomb guard who thought that that was an inappropriate standard or who had much sympathy for tomb guards who had later in life had their tomb badges revoked because they have such deep reverence and love for that place and for those three unknown soldiers who symbolize all the Americans who have given their life in combat.
Let's start, before we go to the unknowns, because I learned a great deal about how that memorial was constructed, let's start with Flags In Day, since we just observed it. The book Sacred Duty begins with Flags In. May I see a show of hands? How many of you know what Flags In Day is? I did not know until I read Sacred Duty. Tell us how you came to begin the book that way.
So Flags In is a tradition going back now in its 8th decade at Arlington. The Old Guard every Thursday afternoon takes off its ceremonial blue uniforms and puts on its combat fatigues. It's the only time they wear those combat fatigues into the cemetery. And they do that because it's truly a military scale operation. Over the course of a few hours on the Thursday before Memorial Day, the Old Guard will place a small American flag in front of every grave in Arlington National Cemetery. This year, it's almost 245,000 flags placed. So they march in with rucksacks and assault packs full of little American flags. For those of you who have a book, you can see a picture of that in the glossy insert in the middle. Large trucks carry in more crates full of flags. They pull water buffaloes so the soldiers can stay hydrated during what can be a very, very long afternoon, can be hot. Now, Thursday afternoon, it was not hot. At least it wasn't sunny. They had very violent thunderstorms. And in fact, you may have seen some of the pictures on social media of tomb guards in their dress blues putting a flag down, of Old Guard soldiers kneeling or squatting in the middle of Arlington Cemetery sections without trees. They do that because there was lightning in the area, so they had to put away their unit colors, which have a staff somewhat like those over there with small metal tips, and their radios to get away from the threat of lightning. They call it the Ranger Squat, which some of these soldiers probably know about and perhaps have done in lightning storms and training. But there was no question that they would stay in the cemetery until they finished the mission of getting all 245,000 of those flags placed. And that's true for the 3 crypts in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and the John F. Kennedy grave site, down to the unknown grave sites of individual soldiers who served in the Civil War whose names are also known only to God. And then for the rest of the weekend, they run roving patrols throughout hours of operations of the cemetery to replace flags that have been taken perhaps by a loved one, or to replace flags that have been damaged by foot traffic or by weather or so forth. They're sending a message to everyone who visits, family, friends, or just people who are coming to pay respect to those who have laid down their life in defense of our nation, that there was a moment in the last few days when a young soldier, however brief, remembered that American service, whether it was service in the war on terrorism or service in the Revolutionary War, and to let them know and to let all those who go through Arlington's gates know over this past weekend that you are not forgotten.
Now, there are a lot of special people here tonight. I want to call attention to 2 of them because they relate. First, the attention to detail that you see in this facility is largely because of the work of a man named Don Bendetti, who was the actual person who oversaw the construction of this. Dorothy Bendetti is with us tonight. Would you stand up, Dorothy, and say hello? I always call her the first lady of the building. And the director of the library is standing in the back, Mike Elsie. Would you put your hand up back there? Mike is a terrific director, but at dinner tonight with Senator Cotton, he related the story to us of having been involved in his service as a Marine in the dignified transfer of remains of the last Marine who died in Vietnam. And it was a very touching story, and I talked to the senator a little bit later about it, And you've heard a few of these stories since the book came out. Can you explain the reaction you're having to Sacred Duty?
Yeah, so I've done probably 5 or 6 signings now for soldiers and their families at Fort Belvoir and Fort Myer in the Washington area in Arkansas, last night at the Reagan Library, tonight here at the Nixon Library. And I've had numerous families who are Gold Star families come up to me. Some of them have their children buried in Arlington. Many other people who have a grandfather or father or mother buried in Arlington, maybe a brother or sister who served in Vietnam or the Korean War, who share their stories with me. It just goes to show what I say in the prologue, what a special place Arlington has in the hearts of our fellow Americans.
If you are a Gold Star family member, would you stand up and let us thank you? And if you are a Blue Star family member, can we have you stand up and thank you for whoever in your family is serving right now? Now, I'd like to start, what hooked me on this book, of course, was knowing the senator, but he also began with military history. After the first chapter about Flags In, the Old Guard is genuinely, I think there's a set of novels to be written about this. Tom Cotton, can you tell people a little bit about the history of the Old Guard?
So the Old Guard is literally the Old Guard of the Army. It's the oldest infantry regiment in the Army. Its roots date back to 1784, 3 years older than our Constitution. And Congress had a pattern then, even before our Constitution, the Continental Congress, as it does now and in recent times, of rapidly reducing the size of our military after war draws down. That's a pattern that repeats itself over American history, I learned during the course of my research for this book. We had something like 60 battalions under arms at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. By 1784, we had barely 2 platoons under arms. Fewer than 100 soldiers. So the Continental Congress decided that that was a unwise situation and that we at least needed a cadre of professional officers and non-commissioned officers to form a core of the Army if there was going to be another war with Great Britain, so they could help train and lead volunteer forces. And really that kind of defined the Old Guard and the other U.S. infantry and artillery and cavalry regiments over the next 160 years. There's a pretty sharp distinction between what's known as the Federals or the regulars in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century and state-based volunteer or militia regiments. So the very first war in which the Old Guard fought was the Northwest Indian War in the territory today that consists mostly of Ohio, Indiana. The Northwest Territories going all the way up to Minnesota, but that war was mostly in the Ohio-Indiana borderlands. And it was a classic insurgency conducted by Indian tribes that did not want to recognize American sovereignty, and British forces who were supposed to withdraw from that territory but did not, and in fact supported that insurgency. The Old Guard's first 2 major battles were not glorious. In fact, they were known as, ignominiously, Harmar's defeat and St. Clair's defeat. When you're the commander of a military regiment, you don't want your military operations to have your name followed by defeat after them. But that's what they were. But then Mad Anthony Wayne, an old commander of George Washington in the Revolutionary War, was recalled by President Washington and said, you need to whip these troops into shape. And he relied on the Old Guard, the 1st Infantry, or the 1st American Regiment as it was known then, to form a corps to train those state-based militias over the next year as they prepared for what became the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the decisive battle of the Northwest Indian Wars that ejected the British from what would become the United States territory once and for all. And that's just one of the earliest examples of battles they fought. They fought around Niagara Falls in the War of 1812, although battles that were not decisive tactically, they were decisive strategically because they showed the British that American regular forces could stand and fight toe-to-toe with them. And then they were instrumental in the Mexican-American War. They were one of the only regiments to fight both the Monterey campaign in 1846, from what is now basically Brownsville to Monterey, and then to fight the Mexico City campaign from what is now Veracruz to Mexico City. And incidentally, that's where they got their name as well. Once Mexico City fell, the Mexican forces had evacuated General Winfield Scott, the commander of the troops on that Mexico City campaign, and incidentally, commander of the Old Guard in those battles in the War of 1812, granted them the privilege of leading the victory march into Mexico City. And as the 3rd Infantry Regiment, as it had come to be known by then and still is formally known today, marched by the reviewing stand, Winfield Scott turned around to his staff officers and said, "Gentlemen, take your hats off to the Old Guard of the Army." And ever since then, they've been known as the Old Guard.
In Sacred Duty, I told you this on the radio, but I'd like the story for the audience. There are 2 traditions in the Old Guard which you repeat 4 or 5 times to drive home, I believe, the point of remembering what those 2 traditions are. And as we went through the library today, Tom spotted the Old Guard in the library. So tell us about the 2 traditions.
So the Old Guard has been the official ceremonial unit of the Army and the escort to the President since April 6, 1948. That means that any time you see President Nixon in this library in video or photos, and he's around soldiers, they're almost certainly going to be Old Guard soldiers. So they conducted his inaugurations, they performed state arrival ceremonies for foreign dignitaries, they led his funeral here on these grounds. If you have any doubt, though, the easiest way to know is to look at a soldier's left shoulder in their dress blue uniforms, like these soldiers are wearing tonight, for what's known as the buff strap. The buff strap is a piece of black leather with a thinner piece of brown leather woven into it, and that resembles the shoulder straps on the rucksacks that Mad Anthony Wayne's troops carried in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The Old Guard has been wearing that, has been authorized to wear that buff strap now for almost 100 years. In 1922, when they were based at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, the Department of the Army authorized the buff strap for wear as a way to commemorate the Old Guard's long and distinguished history as the Army's oldest infantry regiment. And to this day, like I said, if you need to pick out an Old Guard soldier, whether you're in a presidential library or Arlington National Cemetery, the buff strap is the simplest way to do so.
The second tradition has to do with they march in a way that no other unit is allowed to march.
Yeah, so if you ever see a ceremony at Fort Myer with the Old Guard, a retirement ceremony or some kind of review or arrival, they will explain this at great detail. The Old Guard marches with bayonets fixed to their rifles. In fact, they will fix their bayonets to their rifles to a 7-count drum beat and do it in unison. And that is to commemorate the decisive Battle of Cerro Gordo in 1847. Cerro Gordo was the decisive battle in that Mexico City campaign. Santa Anna, after Veracruz had fallen, rushed his troops from Mexico City down to Cerro Gordo. There was only one real highway between Veracruz and Mexico City. It was surrounded by high ground on both sides, and what he thought were impassable ravines and forests. So he dug in artillery on that high ground and prepared for Winfield Scott to march through it. But they made a very fatal mistake. They underestimated American ingenuity and audacity and boldness, because a young captain of engineers was convinced that they could flank that high ground. And Winfield Scott sent him out to find a path, and he came back and he said, in fact, we could, with a little bit of elbow grease, to get our cannons down through the ravines on ropes and pull them back up with the right infantry troops to march through those jungles and the ravines. So they spent almost an entire day doing that, flanking around one of those hills, then waited until the next morning when they launched the attack, and then the 3rd Infantry Regiment, what would soon be known as the Old Guard, conducted the decisive bayonet charge up the hill to finish off one of the Mexican positions and then turn those Mexican guns on the other positions. And the Battle of Cerro Gordo was over, and the Mexicans had lost thousands of troops to either death or to capture. And their pathfinder there at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, that young captain of engineers, was Robert E. Lee.
There's a lot of fascinating history in Sacred Duty, but the reason I think it inspired me and inspires most people is their job for which they are most known, which has many elements, beginning with the dignified transfer of remains. And so, Senator Cotton, can you tell us a little bit about Dover and when it began and what your role was when you joined the Old Guard there?
Yeah, Dover Air Force Base in Delaware has been our port mortuary for several decades on the East Coast. It's now the only port mortuary we have left. That's where the remains of soldiers who are killed overseas return to the United States. There's always been something like the dignified transfer. Colonel Don Lancaster, the commander of Air Force Mortuary Affairs Operations, explained it to me, showed me some of the old pictures from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. It went by different names and had different customs, but there's always some kind of small recognition when those soldiers were returned to their home. But starting in early 2003, just a few days into the Iraq War, the Army staff decided that the Old Guard would perform this mission. In fact, the Old Guard's previous commander, who's featured in this book, Colonel Jason Garkey, was a captain at the time, a commander of a company at the Old Guard, and he got the first Dover mission in those early days of the Iraq War. He still has the written operation order with his handwritten notes on it. By the time I got there in 2007, unfortunately, Dover missions were very common. In fact, we used what was called a DA6, DA Form 6. The veterans here know that that's just a standard duty roster for any kind of duty you can pull in the Army. And all the lieutenants and captains at the Old Guard were on that DA6 for Dover missions. We would typically have about 3 or 4 duty days a month. And unfortunately, in the spring and summer of 2007, at the height of the surge, if you had duty at Dover on a given day of the month, it meant that you were almost certainly going to Dover. I can't remember for many months ever having duty without there being a Dover mission. So as the officer in charge, I would lead a 6-man casket team and take a general escort officer in a Black Hawk helicopter from the capital region up to Dover Air Force Base. We'd land there on the tarmac, usually right as the plane was landing, most often from Ramstein Air Base in Germany. And I would be the first one onto the aircraft, first one into the cargo hold as the officer in charge to inspect the transfer cases to ensure those flags had not shifted or been damaged by the cargo straps in transit, and the first one to carry them off the aircraft as well. My first Dover mission included 3 transfer cases as I write in sacred duty, and I performed them many times over the next 16 months, sometimes with just 1 case, once with as many as 19 cases. And we did them in the dark of night, we did them in the middle of the day, in the blazing heat, in driving blizzards, because just like funerals at Arlington, Dover missions were a no-fail, zero-defect mission. If there were remains coming in from theater, then the Old Guard was going to be there to welcome our fallen comrades back home.
One of the things that sticks with me, I think the book is second week on the New York Times bestselling list, which surprises me a little bit because it's a somber but inspiring book, and I think it's the inspiration that gets people to buy it for Memorial Day and for Father's Day and for friends and family with loved ones in the military. But what really surprised me was the attention to detail for every scheduled burial, including those that were scheduled on 9/11. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, the Old Guard's internal mantra is funerals first. It has a lot of missions and a lot of different kind of units doing a lot of things every single day. These are missions that are conducted at the Pentagon or the White House or the Capitol. Most Army regiments would send a sergeant major and a colonel to be in charge of them. At the Old Guard, you may have a corporal or a lieutenant in charge of them because there's so many missions happening every single day. To give you a sense of the level of responsibility that these young and somewhat inexperienced soldiers have. But all those missions take a back seat to funerals. Ceremonies can be pushed later in the day, they can be rescheduled, missions can be declined in the capital region if that's what it takes to make sure that if a family has a funeral scheduled in Arlington National Cemetery, that the Old Guard is there on time and performing it to standard, which is perfection. Even on 9/11, that was the case. So imagine, if you will, you're in the cemetery on the morning of 9/11. It was a beautiful fall day, the sky was blue, the weather was temperate, and at 9 o'clock, funerals began. Probably 4, 5, 6 funerals were being conducted at 9 a.m. that morning. And at 9:37, a plane flew not from north to south or south to north out of Reagan National, as usually happens, but from west to east, and slammed into the western face of the Pentagon, American Airlines Flight 77. And that Pentagon is maybe 100 yards, 200 yards from the southeastern corner of Arlington National Cemetery. Imagine what it would have been like to be performing one of those funerals or laying to rest your father or your grandfather, and to hear that explosion and to see that smoke cloud rising up in the air. But those soldiers continued their mission until those funerals were over. And then they started the 10 o'clock mission exactly on time, and the 11 o'clock mission, and the rest of those funerals all day long. The rest of the Old Guard soldiers who were not dedicated to funerals that day dropped everything, though, and they changed out their ceremonial blue uniforms and put on their combat fatigues. The medical platoon of the Old Guard, you might say, was the first military unit to deploy to the front lines of a new kind of battle, because they were sent almost immediately to the Pentagon to provide aid to the wounded, and several hundred Old Guard soldiers flowed in after them in the hours that followed to provide additional first aid, security at the Pentagon, both inside and outside, and then sadly over the next month to assist, really to lead, since they're the only large, military unit in the Capitol with young, physically fit soldier, to lead the recovery of remains from that very tangled, dangerous crash site, as well as the recovery of personal effects for family members, as I write in Sacred Duty. They did that for 30 days, and they also had to pull guard duty at Fort Myer as well. They drew their Kevlar helmets and their body armor and their M4s and guarded Fort Myers gates, in addition to their ordinary military police you have there, because Fort Myers is the home of some of the Army and some of the Armed Forces senior generals. And even despite all that, they continue to perform funerals every single day for that 30-day period after 9/11, just like they did last December, whenever the world was transfixed by the state funeral of President George H.W. Bush. Funerals continued in Arlington National Cemetery because they're never canceled.
And they are all zero defect. They have to be perfect. Can you explain why that is the mission mindset of the Old Guard?
Yeah, so it's drilled into the soldiers' minds from the very beginning, but they very quickly internalize that mantra as well, that funerals are a zero defect, no fail mission. In most things you do in the Army, you can make a mistake and fix it. Not always true, but in most things, especially if you're in a training environment, if you're stateside, if you're not downrange. But there are no do-overs in Arlington National Cemetery. The Old Guard might perform 20 or 30 funerals a day. An individual soldier or a small team might perform 6 or 7 funerals in a day. But for each of those families, that is a once-in-a-lifetime moment. That is a lifetime in the making. And the Old Guard soldier very quickly internalizes that perspective and focuses on making everything perfect, from his uniform to his craft, whether it's folding a flag in 1 minute and 55 seconds on the nose, or making 7 rifle cracks sound like 1 during the 3 volley salute, because they want nothing to mar that final perfect moment of honor for the fallen comrade that we're laying to rest and his or her family.
One of the stories, I can't remember the name of the soldier involved, but he presented the flag, and he presented the flag in a way I would have thought was perfect, but it wasn't, and he turned himself in. Would you relate that story?
Yeah, so that's a great story about Sergeant Patrick McAllister, who himself was, like me, actually older than I was on 9/11, and nonetheless enlisted. I think he may be the oldest soldier in the Old Guard, even older than the regimental commander, the regimental sergeant major. And he was presiding, he was the non-commissioned officer in charge of a funeral. He was presiding at the head of a casket. He received the folded flag from the casket team as they marched off. He walked over to the next of kin, as so many of us did so many times, and took a knee to present the condolences. And he flipped the order of the condolences on behalf of the President of the United States Army. He said United States Army first, caught himself, said President of the United States, and a grateful nation. And no one heard. The chaplain didn't hear. The Arlington lady, who's a civilian volunteer who represents the Chief of Staff of the Army, didn't hear. Next of kin obviously didn't know, because he nailed everything else. He could have gotten away with it, but he didn't, because the Old Guard expects perfection from its soldiers. And just like the Army teaches them to uphold the highest standard of integrity from the very first day. So he got back to the bus. He immediately called the ceremonial affairs office at the regimental headquarters and reported himself for the infraction. And the captain who's in charge of memorial affairs recommended to the battalion commander in charge of it that they decertify him. So he'd have to go through all of his training again, which can take up to 2 months to complete. And the battalion commander reflected on it, he said, for a couple days. And he decided only to make him retest on the condolences, which he passed very quickly and easily. But the story doesn't end there. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Kehoe, himself a 5-time combat veteran and veteran of the 75th Ranger Regiment as well, went down to Charlie Company, where Sergeant McAllister was assigned one morning that week for their morning formation, and he gave Sergeant McAllister a commander's coin for excellence. And I think that puzzled a lot of the young soldiers, according to Colonel Kehoe, because they knew that he had made this mistake, that he had reported himself. Everyone in Charlie Company was waiting to hear what would happen to Sergeant McAllister. And he said to those young soldiers, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I'm not encouraging you to make mistakes. We aim for perfection in everything we do, and that's what I want you to continue to do. But even more than that, we have to uphold the standards of integrity of this regiment and the Army and what the American people expect on their behalf in Arlington National Cemetery. And this is a fine example of a soldier with outstanding integrity. When he made a mistake and no one was watching, he turned himself in. And I want you all to follow that model in everything you do here in Arlington National Cemetery, everything you do for as long as you're in the United States Army, and everything you do for as long as you're a citizen of this country.
Now, you, Senator, are a Ranger, and Rangers lead the way is the motto. When you came out of the surge leading a platoon in Baghdad, would you explain to the audience how you got selected for the Old Guard, and then what the difference was from going from a combat role to the Old Guard, and how did it change you?
Well, you know, people weren't trying to kill me anymore. That was the biggest difference. So normally the Old Guard is a volunteer-only all or applicant unit. Like any infantry regiment, the lion's share of its soldiers are young privates. They're recruited from Fort Benning. They have very high standards because the Army, on behalf of the nation, expects a lot from soldiers in this very sensitive, very prominent mission. So they have height and weight standards. They have physical fitness standards. They have very high test scores in the Army's general intelligence test. They can have no, character flaws or legal blemishes on their record. For officers and NCOs, there's additional eligibility requirements. So, for instance, officers have to be Ranger qualified. They have to be airborne qualified. In those days, in 2006, they really wanted you to have a combat tour behind you because it would have set back one's career to not have led at the company level in combat before going to a unit like the Old Guard. And one day, I didn't fill out an application. I was still in Iraq, had about a month to go. I didn't really know what I'd do when I got back to Fort Campbell at the 101st. I just got an email that said your application to the 101st has been, or to the Old Guard has been accepted, which was curious because I hadn't submitted an application. So I went up to the call trailer that night and I called the adjutant, the personnel officer at the Old Guard, and said, "Hey, sir, I got this email and says I'm supposed to report in February." He said, "Do you need to change the date? We can probably be flexible." I said, "No, I didn't submit an application. I was wondering why I got selected." And he said, "Oh, you're one of those guys, right?" So at first I was a little apprehensive. One of those guys, not good in the Army. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we're really short of officers and we're a priority mission for the Army, so we were able to hand select 6 officers." So at this point now I was excited. Normally when you're hand selected for something in the Army, it means that you've performed well and given greater responsibility or a promotion. I said, "Well, how did you hand select me?" And he said, "Well, we went through the ordinary criteria, the ones I just outlined to you, and just searched personnel records for people that met those criteria." And I said, "Well, there must be more than 6 of us, because that's how many they had selected." He said, "Oh yeah, there's a couple hundred of you." So at this point I was certain it was because of my superior performance as a new lieutenant in Iraq. I said, "So how did you just hand select 6 of us?" And he said, "Well, we just rank ordered you by height and chose the 6 tallest ones." And sure enough, about 3 months later, there were 6 new lieutenants and captains at the Old Guard, and we all had Screaming Eagle combat patches on our right shoulder. We'd all just redeployed from Iraq with the 101st Airborne, and one was 6'7", and I'm 6'5", and the other 4 were 6'3", and we looked good out there on the marks at that height.
One more question before we go to the tomb. 3-minute go.
So the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, I said, is a very special, unique unit inside the Old Guard. It's one of the smallest. It's only got 25 or 30 soldiers at any given time. And they have fully qualified tomb guards who can perform all the missions on their own without oversight. They're called the Tomb Sentinels. They've earned the Tomb Badge, which usually takes about 9 to 12 months. And then they have tomb guards who are not fully qualified or at various stages of their training. They're referred to new men. Even though you can be a female soldier at the tomb, there have been 4 tomb sentinels who were women. And at various stages of their training, they do what's called earning a walk, which is their chance to walk the mat for a shift during hours of operation, when normally they're learning their craft outside of hours of operation of the cemetery. And the way they earn a mat or earn a walk during daytime hours, for the most part, is something called quarter till, which they stand in a corner of the tomb quarters at a quarter till the walk, and they get quizzed on some trivia questions. They have to learn 17 pages of knowledge about the tomb and the cemetery, and the people buried there. And whoever wins that quiz, if anyone wins it, oftentimes they don't, will be told 3 minutes, go. And they run down the hallway to their locker room where they have to get in uniform in 3 minutes or less and be back ready to go out onto the plaza. And that's a way to stress to them how they have to always be ready in case something happens on the plaza that requires them to be ready to go in just 3 minutes. And I saw that happen on many times, not just the 3 minute go as a training exercise, because you still have to pass the 3 minute go if you won the trivia competition before you get out the door. And I saw people fail 3 minute goes as well. But I also saw tomb sentinels have to conduct 3 minute goes in an unplanned, hasty fashion. You know, someone was getting ready to go out the door and maybe the buckle on their ceremonial belt blew off and there's no way to fix that in that amount of time. So a soldier who's otherwise standing around in khaki pants and a polo shirt has to run down to the tomb sentinel's locker room and get in his uniform and be ready to go, because whatever happens in those quarters, when you hit the hour or the half hour and those bells go off on the first gong, that door is opening and a tomb guard is going out that door for the changing of the guard.
Now I want to close. Senator Cotton's got to make the airport tonight because Arkansas, as you may have known, is under duress. How is your home state right now?
We've got a lot of flooding, unfortunately, historic flooding in many communities, including my own in Arkansas. So we're going to be touring it tomorrow with our governor and the rest of our federal delegation, our emergency management officials who are out there working around the clock.
So I could literally talk to him, and I have on air for 2 hours about the book. You'll find it to be an extraordinary read, and Sacred Duty you'll just won't put it down. But could you tell us the story of how the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier came to be? Because how many of you have been to it? The history of it is fascinating, a short version.
Sure. So World War I was the first war in which we had large numbers of Americans killed overseas. Obviously, we had Americans who died in the Mexican-American War, or in Cuba during the very short Spanish-American War, in the Philippines during the Philippine insurrection there at the turn of the century, but nothing like World War I, where we had more than 117,000 Americans killed overseas. Many of them were identified. ID tags had been adopted in large measure by then. But they were, for the most part, buried where they fell, which had been the military custom for ages. After some lobbying by war widows and war mothers, though, Congress decided to offer the disinterment and the return of remains of any American soldier there. That was over the objection of Army leaders, I should say. When war widows and war mothers lobby Congress and Army generals are on the other side, guess who typically wins that lobbying campaign? So there are about 30,000, 40,000 families decided to leave their sons and their husbands and their dads overseas. That's one reason why we have all those cemeteries in France right now. For the most part, they were brought home, but that left open the question what to do with the number of unknown remains for whom there was no known identity. There was some debate in that, but it was really settled on what is then Armistice Day, now Veterans Day, 1920, when the United Kingdom interred an unknown soldier at Westminster Abbey, and France interred an unknown soldier under the Arc de Triomphe. Hundreds of thousands of French and British citizens turned out to honor those unknown soldiers, and that really galvanized public opinion and helped Congress pass a bill that had already been under consideration. And Woodrow Wilson signed it as one of his last acts in office on March 4th, 1921, giving the Army about 8 months to prepare for the interment of the first unknown, the World War I unknown, on what was then Armistice Day, November 11th, 1921. They went through an elaborate selection process in France to ensure that there was no way to identify the unknown. 4 candidates were chosen, all records were destroyed, they were transported to a central location in the middle of the night with no other persons present. Soldiers, active duty soldiers on duty in France went in and out of the room and alternated moving the 4 sets of remains around so no one would know which one came from which cemetery. And then Sergeant Edward Younger, who was a highly decorated veteran of World War I, was given a bouquet of roses, and he walked in and he said that as he was walking by, he just felt that it was a buddy calling out to him. He put the roses on the one of the caskets, and that became the World War I unknown, who was then transported to great fanfare from the people of France across the countryside on a ship back to Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., where he received a reception fitting of a admiral of the navies or a general of the armies. So he laid in state at the Capitol. There was a state funeral and procession for him to Arlington National Cemetery, and then Warren Harding stood in as the next of kin, presented him the Medal of Honor, and interred him on Armistice Day, 1921. The first tomb was very small, probably no higher than this table. It was about 10 years until there was a competition that was to design what we now know as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then it was sculpted in site and then placed by the early 1930s. And they went through various stages of guards. First, no guards, then a guard for the amphitheater was also watching over the tomb, a dedicated civilian guard for the tomb, and then during hours of operation of the cemetery, and then on midnight, July 2nd, 1937, the military began to guard the tomb around the clock, and that's happened ever since then, which the old guard has done ever since April 6, 1948.
With that, I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience so that Tom, the senator, can get to the book signing and make sure he gets you all your signed books. Chris has got the microphone. I don't know where you are, Chris.
Just to your left, Hugh, and Mr. Senator. Our first question is from one of the members of, a member of one of our Gold Star families, Gary Brattain. Gary is father to a friend of mine who lost his life while serving. Gary, what is your question for Senator Cotton?
Okay. Our son and the gentleman that he died with were honored at the tomb. This is in 2005, okay? When they were doing Faces of the Fallen. I don't know if you remember the exhibit at the Women's Memorial. And one of the things we learned, his classmates from Benning, from jump school, had chosen the 3rd Infantry. We were under the impression, and I think you explained it, is that kind of a step in career military to serve at the 3rd Infantry?
It is, except for me, it is a very good thing to have done, especially for officers or NCOs. Not many people have a chance to do it, but it gives you another step in command or in a leadership position. So, I was a platoon leader with the 101st. Then I was a platoon leader again with the Old Guard. My platoon sergeant, likewise, had been a platoon sergeant with the 101st. He did it again. Jason Garkey, who I write about in the book, was there 3 times. He was there as a platoon leader, a company commander, and then the regimental commander. So especially for officers and NCOs who are making a career out of the military, anytime you can get more time in leadership is good, and to be entrusted with such a sensitive and prominent job is a career enhancer as well. I would say especially, though, for those young privates. I saw this when I was a platoon leader in the Old Guard. I saw it over the last year or so. These privates, who are some of the top-notch soldiers in the Army, are taken out of Fort Benning, where they're learning their infantry skill, and placed in an infantry regiment, but one that primarily performs ceremonial tasks. And unfortunately, sometimes the Old Guard loses really good soldiers who have spent 2 or 3 years there and don't move on to a traditional infantry division like the 101st or like the 3rd Infantry Division, because they're nervous that they haven't been advancing as a infantryman. And one thing that I tried to drive home with them as a platoon leader, and that I have also driven home with some of the young soldiers I met over the last year, is that you can always learn how to employ a machine gun. You can learn small unit tactics at the fire team and the squad level. Those don't take that long to pick up. What you can't learn are the intangible skills that you've got here at the Old Guard: leadership, discipline, mission focus, handling ambiguous situations with imperfect information. That's the things that the Army values most. And you may go on to the 173rd Airborne in Italy, as one of the soldiers in the book does, and no less than some of your soldiers do about tactics. Within 6 months, you'll be fine. They'll never have had the experience of having to perform in a presidential inauguration as a corporal with no guidance from above. They'll never have had the experience of having to been the senior man at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier during sensitive wreath-laying ceremonies. Those are the kind of things that you can't learn anywhere else in the Army, and that's why so many Old Guard soldiers go on to perform jobs of greater responsibility in the military.
Thank you again, sir, for your sacrifice and that of your family.
Mr. Senator, directly to your right. This question from a member of our band, Sean Montoya, 18-year-old Villa Park High School student. He's in the 12th grade. Sean, what is your question?
Mr. Senator, what words of wisdom would you have for a young man wanting to join a service?
Join the Army. What do you play? What instrument do you play? Okay. So as I write in the Old Guard, the Old Guard has the fife and drum corps, which is, you might say, the highest educated element in the entire United States Army. Almost everyone there has a college degree. Many of them have masters, and a handful even have doctorates from places like Juilliard or Berkeley. So if you want to be an Army musician, there's few places to do it better than at Fort Myer. But I would say to you, I would say to any young people in the audience here tonight, whether you're 18 or 22, or like me, 27 when I made that decision, you'll never go wrong joining the Armed Forces of the United States. I know you may have doubts, you may think it's not for you. Trust me, the Army takes all kinds. It takes trombone players, it takes head cheerleaders, it takes the quarterback, it takes bookworms, and it turns them into soldiers. And what you will gain in 3 or 4 years serving our country in uniform is something that you cannot gain anywhere else. You won't get it in college, you won't get it in the workforce. You will learn not just skills, both tangible and some of the intangible skills I was talking about earlier, but most importantly, a sense of serving something greater than yourself and the respect of your fellow citizens. So if you're young and you're thinking about joining the military, you should do it, and you should probably do the Army as well. But the other branches are good too.
We do have
our Anaheim recruiting detachment right here is thanking me for that. So I'm sure they'll be willing to sign you up right now before your parents can dissuade you.
We have time for one last question. Center of the room, Mr. Senator. But before we get to that question, I want to remind everyone, first, we do have books for sale in the museum store, so pick one up if you don't have one. And Senator Cotton will be signing copies of your book in our front lobby. When you walk down this long hallway, head to the right, there's a sign that says book signing. Just follow it. But do keep in mind, he has to catch a flight to get back to his home state and take care of some business. So we will be moving fairly quickly through this signing. Our last question. Sir, what is your last question? Or what is your question?
Thank you. Senator Cotton, fellow Army vet here. Thanks for your service. Appreciate it. My dad's interned at Arlington last year. He passed away. He was a sailor. And so the Honor Guard were sailors. And I was wondering what the relationship between the other services Honor Guards and the Old Guard is there at Arlington for funerals.
Yeah, so all 5 services have a ceremonial unit. The Old Guards is by far the largest. That's largely because the Army has been by far the largest service, especially in World War II and Korea and in Vietnam. So to give you a sense of scale, the Old Guard has about 1,500 soldiers. The other 4 services, ceremonial units combined, have about 600 or 700 total. So in general, they'll perform the funerals for their own veterans or their fallen from overseas. That's why you saw a Navy funeral. That's not entirely pure, though. The Old Guard has the caisson platoon, which is the only equine unit left in our military. So if you have a funeral for the other 4 services, service members that has a horse-drawn caisson, those will be Old Guard soldiers participating in it. The Marine Corps, if it's a Marine colonel or general who's being laid to rest, he merits a riderless horse as well, what's called the comparison horse. That also will be an Old Guard soldier with Old Guard horses, too. And then in ceremonies, they performed in joint armed forces ceremonies together all the time. You might have seen them Monday for Memorial Day, the wreath-laying ceremony in which the Vice President appeared. Anytime they're at the Pentagon or the White House, it's almost always a joint armed forces ceremony, although the Old Guard is both the largest and the oldest service, takes the lead. It always provides the officer in charge. It usually provides the fife and drum corps. It provides the most members of the Armed Forces Color Guard and a lot of the behind-the-scenes planning and support personnel. But inside the cemetery, absent those 2 cases of the caisson platoon providing the horse-drawn caisson or the comparison horse, then each of the services will perform the military honor funerals for its own fallen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Senator Cotton.
Thank you.